thanks all for coming today. Let's start, even though it's rather few. I see the Independence Day has restricted the attendance a bit. Katja Tuokko from Ministry is here to present their views and what's happening on EU level. But please.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for the invitation to come and speak here. So my name is Katja Tuokko. I come from the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Employment, so TEM. And I was asked to stand quite still and speak on the microphone, otherwise I would move around and come maybe closer to you, but I will try to stand still. I'll leave some of my cards here if you want to grab one or if you have some questions in the end, so please don't hesitate to take one. I am myself, my background is in European administration, EU law, and after that I've worked around, let's say, 4 years in energy affairs. So I'm not an engineer, so in case my logic or what I'm telling you is something that you don't understand, just please raise your hand and ask any questions if you have. And we just talked with Mikko that perhaps in the end I can also tell a bit about my work, how it's like to work in a ministry, or what does the energy department of the ministry do. But before I forget, one thing I wanted to mention regarding the topic of today is that Finland is holding the EU presidency, so every EU country holds the presidency in a rotation in 2 years' time, and for that purpose we're going to have one new recruit in the energy department for a 2-year contract, a junior position, a person with a master's degree and maybe a bit of work experience to work on the EU presidency preparations in the field of energy. And that will be a job that will be opened via the public administration, the valtiolle.fi internet site next spring, along with a big program where we recruit 40 people like this to work on different topics in the public administration, and one of them in the field of energy. So if any one of you is interested in that position, keep it in mind and look at the website around March, April. I think that's when the application process will start. So I will just say that because I thought I will forget in the end, in case any one of you is interested in that. But apart from that, I'll go to the subject of today. So I've heard that you've heard a lot from different stakeholders already in the field of energy, and also maybe some words already about the EU, or it's a topic that comes and goes often, and decision making and legislation. So I hope it will not be repetition. And what I've thought I will talk about is first spending a bit of time, not too much, but a bit of time explaining a bit what is energy policy in the context of the EU, the European Union. Because often the decision making, and if you read the news about what the EU does, it seems obscure. What is the EU? Where does this come from? Who has an impact? Who decides this? So I will try to give some sort of a background on what is energy policy in the European Union, and also decision making in the field of energy policy in the European Union, because you have to understand a bit what are the dynamics or who is making these decisions in order to understand how to impact that policy and what kind of policy comes out. So I will go through these issues, and then after that I'll go to the topical EU energy affairs, so discussing what is going on at the moment in the European Union in the field of energy, and often now, as you see, it's interlinked energy and climate policy. It's often one entity. And I'll give just a few examples to give you a flavor what is going on. And then there will be, I hope, time for questions as well. A lot of that, and in any case, whenever you have a question, don't hesitate to ask. But I start a bit from the beginning. I hope for not from too far away. But just to understand why do we have the European Union, it is because these 28 EU countries have wanted so. And why do we make decisions on energy policy at the European level? It's because these EU countries have thought that the issues, the challenges, and maybe the possibilities that we have are cross-border challenges and possibilities. And in order to embrace those possibilities and solve those problems, you need cross-border cooperation. So, for example, climate change is one good example of this. Emission reductions, doing emission reductions of CO2 emissions is something that doesn't know borders. So this is a global challenge, and therefore you have to answer to it with cross-border solutions. And that's the reason why these countries have come together. They've decided to give some of their sovereignty to a supranational body, to the European body. And therefore they cooperate in different fields of legislation. Not all, but some. And I will come back to what policy fields in a moment. And just for the Finns, Finland joined 95, as you all know, so it's been a while when Finland has been member of the European Union. And in order to understand the EU, you have to understand what are the European institutions. So often when we talk about the EU, we don't really know what are we referring to actually. Are we referring to the member states of the EU? Are we referring to the European Commission? Are we referring to the European Court of Justice or the European Parliament? So often it's all of these different institutions. And you could say that there are 5 principal policy institutions, so don't mind the European Court of Auditors, that's not the prime institution. One anecdote, when you often have a job interview or another kind of an interview or where you are asked what are the most important EU institutions, and the person quickly goes to the Wikipedia page, Googling EU institutions, and it's the Court of Auditors that comes up first because it begins with an A, and then people say the European Court of Auditors. But that's not one of the principles, even though many people give that question when they Google the institutions. But you could say that the 5 principal institutions are the European Commission, the Council of the European Union, the European Parliament, European Council, and the European Court of Justice, which all sound awfully alike and things that you can easily mix up. So I'll just say a few words. What do these institutions do in the field of energy policy? They have other tasks as well, for sure, but in the field that is of relevance to us. So first, maybe the Council of the European Union, because I come from the ministry. The Council of the European Union is the body where the member states of the EU, so the 28 member states, gather. So in the field of energy, there's a working group on energy working group, that's how it's called, and it meets once or twice per week in that building that's in the picture. Let me see if this works. Yep, this building over here, and that's where the civil servants meet and try to negotiate and discuss a common position on a EU file, let's say Renewable Energy Directive, Energy Efficiency Directive, another file. And often, especially before, the member states had that was the most important decision-making body. But maybe as you've heard and seen is that the European Parliament is more and more on an equal footing to the member states in many policy fields. So it's not only the member states that make decisions, also the European Parliament is a legislative body, so it's a body that has legislative power and makes decisions. So it's this one over here. And the European Parliament consists, it doesn't consist of national decision makers in a sense that Finnish MEPs that are elected to the European Parliament would be a group, and Swedish MEPs would be a group, but it consists of political parties. So each Finnish political party, let's say, is a member in a European party. EPP is the right-wing party, the S&D is the Social Democratic Party, and so on. So these are European politicians that are grouped into political parties, and they make decisions along those political lines, and they shouldn't be there representing their national interest. Like a Finnish MEP shouldn't only be there for the national position, but they are there to represent their party, you could say. And together with the member states, the European Parliament, these are the two legislative bodies that do decisions in the field of energy policy. So they are the ones that decide basically what is the content of the Renewable Energy Directive or the emissions trading scheme and so on. But then often when we talk about the EU, we use it as a synonym for the European Commission. Because that's maybe often the most, the gray area, that entity that is the most difficult to understand. What does it actually do? The European Commission is, they are civil servants, like the people here in Finland in the ministry are. They are also civil servants, and they are grouped similarly as a national administration would be. So there's also an energy department there. There's an environmental department, there's a transport department, and so on, a foreign policy department. And if you compare to the national level, you can't quite say that the European Commission would be the same as a ministry, because it's a political body. Perhaps you've heard of Jean-Claude Juncker, that's the head of the European Commission at the moment, or Jyrki Katainen is the Finnish commissioner in the European Commission. These are politicians, so they are politically elected, and the Commission also has a political agenda. So in that sense, it's not quite the same as you would say public administration in Finland is, even though it consists of civil servants. So these are the three main institutions that make EU law. And then in addition, you have to mention the European Council, which is when the prime ministers of all European countries meet. So they kind of draw the big lines. So they meet quite rarely, I think twice per year, and they make a 3-page document on what should be done in different fields. So, for example, in the field of energy policy, in 2014, the prime ministers of all EU countries draw up a document saying that the EU should decrease its greenhouse gas emissions at least 40% by 2030. And that was their decision that they made. And all policy after that has been focusing on that decision, or has been done based on that decision. So they draw up a big line, what should be done, and then these three institutions basically start working on what the prime ministers have said. And then you have the Court of Justice, so that's the court system. So when you have EU law in place, and if countries are not implementing that law, or if someone is breaking that law, you take that case in the end to the European Court of Justice. So they have the power. And EU law is always primary, you say, in law, but like more important than national law. So that's why EU law is important. National law and EU law cannot be in contradiction. So when you decide something at the European level, it will be there also at national level. It will be in national legislation. Do you have any overall questions? I just tried to briefly tell what are the European institutions from the legislation point of view, and this goes for EU energy policy, how it's done. Any questions of clarification or something you want to know more about how they function? I will go a bit more into depth in a bit describing the Council and the European Parliament especially. If not, just go forward. So then about the powers of the EU. So what does the EU do and why does it have power in the energy field? So member states have decided to give powers to the EU on certain fields. So we all have the euro, we have the European Monetary Union. That's a field where the EU has exclusive power. So that's why, for example, in the times of Finland having a financial crisis, we cannot do much with our currency. That currency, that power is at the EU level. We cannot do much about that. But when it comes to education, for example, the EU doesn't have a lot to say. They only support and give some guidance and some best practices that member states can share with each other. So they don't do much. And then there are other fields where the powers are shared between the European Union and then the member states. And the field of energy is one of these fields. And the EU always has done a new constitution every now and then. And the last constitution was the Lisbon Treaty that was done around 10 years ago. And there, the member states decided to give a bit more power to the EU on the field of energy. And after that Lisbon Treaty, more and more EU legislation on energy policy, or more and more issues related to energy are present in the EU. And that's why when you are a student of energy affairs or you work in the field of energy, you cannot really overlook the EU. It has a lot of influence. So what does it mean that it's a shared competence? So what do the member states do? What is done at the national level? What is done at the European level? So at the European level, as I just described, this decision made by the prime ministers of EU member states, the European Union can decide that the EU has to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions at least 40% by 2030. Compared to 1990 levels of greenhouse gas emissions. So this is EU competence. This is what the EU can decide. So therefore, at the EU level, we also have targets for energy efficiency. There's a target for how much we have to increase renewable energy, and so on. But what the EU cannot decide is how the member states reduce those greenhouse gas emissions, or what kind of renewable energy does Finland use, or other EU countries, what kind of renewable energy is it? So that is something that the countries themselves decide. So no one can come to Finland and say that you have to use more nuclear power or less nuclear power, or you have to increase wind energy or anything like this. This is what the countries themselves decide. And that's why if you look at the energy mixes of different countries, you see that they're very different. So there are targets at EU level, but the means are something that are decided at national level. So that's an important thing to remember about the energy policy at the EU level. And then everything that is related to internal market. So there's an internal market now for electricity, internal market for gas. So there's a will to create one market where electricity flows, for example. These are then in practice regional markets, like there is a Nordic electricity market, Nordic Baltic gas market. So to create cross-border markets is something that the EU also wants to achieve, for example, by giving funding to new projects that put countries together or make these interconnections function. So I think if you remember something about EU in the field of energy policy, remember its role, or its how it is situated when you compare to different other fields, that it's a shared competence. And that's always something that decision makers then struggle with. Is this an EU competence or is this a national competence? You often have a fight because it's not straightforward. It can be national or it can be something that the EU decides. So this was general overview about the EU. Then going a bit more to energy policy itself. So I think you are well aware that also national energy policy, maybe this is something that the stakeholders have already told you when they've come here, that Finnish energy policy basically has these same goals as are listed here. The EU and Finland have very similar goals. What should the energy policy achieve? And there are 3 different goals that are overlapping, that can maybe contradict each other, and maybe some stakeholders or entities sometimes forget one of them. But what the energy policy should do, it should answer to these 3 goals, which are energy security, fostering economic growth, and then reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So, for example, if you think of increasing renewable energy production, that might achieve the goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but then it should also, that policy for renewable energy should be done so that it also gives you a sustainable economic growth and also energy security. And whichever policy field you look at, you have to keep in mind the three different goals that are in place. And this is something that is unique to energy policy. These, not all fields have such diverging goals, and at least personally for me, this is why the field is so interesting and challenging, because sometimes achieving economic growth can be contradictory to greenhouse gas emissions, or achieving economic security can be contradictory to economic growth. And you have to keep in mind all of these 3 different goals. And I think that's why it's a fascinating field to work in, actually. And something that other policy fields might not necessarily have. I go a bit into how decisions are made in EU energy policy. This might be your students of energy technology. This might sound to you like lawyer talk, but I think we have to a bit go into this, understand how the policy is done, because if you don't know a bit how this legislation is being done, you don't know who are the actors, who should you influence if you want to influence the decision making, and when should you be there actually, and all these questions. So even though you work maybe in energy technology in the future, if you ever work with EU affairs, you have to know the dynamics that are there. So this is a very, very, very simple way of putting it. When I studied as a student this legislative procedure, this is a graph of one page. Who does what and when, and where does the energy file then go, and who decides, and however. But in a nutshell, this is how the 3 different institutions function when there is a EU file on energy policy that is being negotiated. So this applies to any. I'm sure you read the news on energy policy a lot, and you see that there's a directive on electricity markets now going on. There's one on renewable energy that is being negotiated at the moment. Also on emissions trading, the 4th phase of emissions trading. One on energy efficiency directive. Different kinds of files on climate change, which is very interlinked to energy nowadays. Or let's say energy security. There's a file related to the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, for example. So many different EU files going on. And if you think How is the decision then done on these different files? Actually, all of the ones I mentioned, except issues related to energy security, are done in co-decision between the Council, so the Member States, and the European Parliament. It used to be called the co-decision procedure, which kind of makes more sense, and now it's called the ordinary legislative procedure. And that's the name of the way how these different institutions make decisions on energy policy, most energy policy, not issues that are related to foreign policy or energy security. So, for example, now there's discussions on this Nord Stream 2 pipeline. This is something where different kinds of decision-making rules apply, because that's where you come to the shared competence issue. Internal market, energy efficiency, renewable energy, these are files where EU has a say, but then there are other files where also member states has a say, and there the parliament has a smaller role basically. That's the difference. So I will tell just a bit what happens in the EU when a directive, for example, is being negotiated. Yeah, please.
I think, isn't the situation of energy security is a little bit more cloudy, because some things, well, energy security is a term which is understood in different languages in the EU as being either safety or external security. So certain things have been in security. I can't remember myself what the rules are actually, the competences. Yeah. But for example, critical infrastructure, that was a ordinary procedure, if I remember correctly, some years ago now. Whereas things which are sort of what we would understand as security with respect to energy supply externally, they are outside of the
it's a fuzzy area. For example, there was you're right, just this year there was a directive on security of gas supply, and this was done in co-decision, for example. So that was something where the EU had the competence. Whereas then when you have an agreement with a third country, for example, on energy community, which is a community between Southeast European countries and the European Union, this is not co-decision, and that's a community that tries to put in place EU market rules in EU neighboring countries, and that's more external affairs, for example. So yeah, so you're right. Yeah.
I'm sorry to draw the
yeah,
point,
please.
But it's an interesting one in this region. Nord Stream 1. I mean, I was working in Brussels at the time of that.
Okay.
I don't remember anyone really. There was any EU competence in the first Nord Stream. It was simply a bilateral agreement between Germany and Russia, and I can't. So I'm actually wondering. Actually, I didn't know that Nord Stream 2 that there is a sort of file on that in Brussels. Can you expand in any way upon actually what is now the EU competence in that area?
That's an interesting question, because that goes into the eternal draw whether something is national or whether something is European. So normally these pipeline projects are bilateral. They are something, as you said, agreement between Russia and Germany, and then a pipeline passes through Finnish water and Danish water, and they give a permit to that file and so, or that pipeline and so on. So that is something that traditionally has not been seen as a European issue. But now there's a new effort to build another pipeline, as you said, which is similar. They call it the Nord Stream 2. And there the European Union would like to basically more put in place or put the EU internal market rules, implement those or put those in force to apply to that pipeline. But many people don't agree with that, or that is a discussion going on at the moment whether the EU should have a say on something like that or not, and that's not at all clear. And the European Commission thinks that this should be a European matter, whereas many member states, as you can maybe imagine, don't think so. So that's one example of energy being a shared competence, and when it is shared, you then come to some examples where the border is being drawn, whether it's an EU issue or not. So it's an interesting example of the evolution of this field as well, because there is more and more, there's a lot happening in the field of energy at the EU level. So that's one example of new issues coming up. So yeah, that's a very actual topic. So that's a good example. So okay, we have one Brussels expert in the room, so that's good news. I will explain a bit then in these issues where you have a European competence, so the EU decides how do these different institutions function. So when you think about we said that the Parliament and the member states are the ones that have the legislative power. So these are the legislative bodies that make decisions. So what does the Commission do? Well, what does it do? The Commission always tries to defend a European interest. So it's called the guardian of the treaties, so the constitutions of the European Union. And it tries to listen to everyone, all the member states, all the different stakeholders, the European Parliament, and understand what is needed. So there are often the European Commission makes a communication. It makes like a couple of pager document communicating what would be needed in its view at European level, what kind of new legislation. Different stakeholders react to that. There's a discussion, there's a consultation, they ask a question online, and normal people, just ordinary citizens, individuals can reply, member states can reply, stakeholders can reply. And this is what they do. And the Commission almost has a monopoly. It's almost the only actor that can suggest legislation. There are some exceptions, but in the field of energy, it is the Commission basically that suggests legislation. So when you hear that a new proposal for Renewable Energy Directive or other EU legislation is on the table, it's the Commission that makes a proposal, which is often a 100-page document almost, with an impact assessment with explanatory text, and maybe the proposal itself, it might be 5 pages, but a big chunk of files that it publishes. And it's often a long-awaited document, something that the stakeholders are well aware of, that a new proposal is coming up on, for example, now 1 year ago, the Clean Energy Package came out, so 8 different proposals in the field of energy, maybe you've heard of that, and they are currently being negotiated in the EU. And all the stakeholders wait for the Commission proposal, and it's an anxious moment. What is actually inside that proposal? What are they suggesting? And after the Commission makes this proposal, it sends it to the member states, so the Council and the European Parliament. And at that moment, both institutions, in practice, I think in principle it should be the Parliament first, but it's both of them that start revising the proposal, start going through it and thinking, what do we think of this? Is it a good or bad? What do we want to change? Why? And so on. And they both start on their own front negotiations. The Parliament tries to make its own position on this proposal, and then the member states, the Council, start making their own decision on an energy file. This is a picture from the European Parliament, a bit blurry, from the ITRE committee, which is the committee that takes care of industrial affairs, research, and energy. So if you ever see that the European Parliament is discussing an energy file, it's this specific committee where the file is being discussed. And the parliament, not all MEPs, those parliamentarians that have most power are often those that are in charge of a file. So only those parliamentarians or those parliamentarians that sit in this committee, the ITRE committee, have the most say in energy topics. Even though there are 700 MEPs in the European Parliament, the ones in this committee have the most say. And the most say often the rapporteur has the most say in these files. So one MEP that is picked to steer this file through the legislative procedure in the European Parliament. And they make a report out of it, and they are kind of that's the most important person in the European Parliament steering that file. Here in the picture, there are two guys, well, most importantly this guy, very influential one single MEP out of the 700 ones in the field of energy, Luxembourgish Green MEP called Claude Tung, who, for example, now is the rapporteur in one of those 8 energy files that are going on at the moment. An old politician or someone with a lot of experience who has a big impact on the say of the European Parliament. And now, for example, he's in charge of a proposal on the governance of the energy and climate, European energy and climate policy. So an effort or a proposal to make a new governance system on how, if the EU countries are trying to reduce their emissions now and increase renewable energy, how is this whole thing governed, and what is the transparency of these agreements, for example. And I think he's a smart guy, and I think he picked a file that is actually a very important file, because in the end, even though what you agree is important, but in the end what is important also is how it's governed and how transparent it is. So how, for example, different member states have to do reporting and have to do planning on their energy and climate plans. So he's chosen that file for himself, and I think there's a reason for that. And then when you go to the EU member states, there who is important is always the presidency country. So as I said, Finland will be president of the Council in 2 years' time, 2019. Now it's Estonia that has the presidency of the Council. So all countries rotate the presidency. And last time Finland was the president 2006, so it was a while ago, so 13 years in between, so quite a long time as there are so many member states. When the member states make decisions, it's really the chairman and the presidency that have a lot of say. So, for example, now there, as I said, there are these 8 different proposals. The Estonian presidency is the one that decides a lot what is their priority, which of these proposals do they take forward, which ones do they think have to be agreed first, which ones after that, and they listen to everyone, and you need to listen to everyone when you are the president, and need to take everyone's opinion and the national interests. You need to listen to all of them and take them into account. So this lady over here is the Estonian energy minister, Kadri Simson. So she's the one that, for example, chairs the meetings of the energy ministers at the EU level. Very important person. And with her, this is an Estonian negotiator, but with her are 2 commissioners, so people from the commission. This is the climate commissioner, Aries Kaniete, and this is the energy commissioner, Markus Šefčovič. So they are the decision makers from the European Commission. Just want to have a lot of pictures, but I think it's always nice to show pictures, so to get an idea what it really is like. This is a picture taken from a meeting of energy ministers in September, where energy ministers discussed this big legislative file that is going on at the moment, the clean energy package. taken from Tallinn. All right, then I wanted to say a few words about having an impact, or how to lobby, how to present your interest in the EU. So as we discussed, there are many different institutions, and you have to know which one to influence at which time of the proposal. And as I said, the Commission makes the proposal, and that's a long-awaited moment. And when you have that print-out copy of the proposal for a law in energy field in your hands, after that, changing those details is more difficult. So making changes or having an impact, it's easier the earlier you do it, and more difficult the further the decision-making procedure goes. Because changing those details that are already printed in that copy, that are in that law, that proposal, it gets more and more difficult with time as more and more people start discussing the issue. So you often use this kind of a graph to show, I put that text in black because it couldn't fit there, that this is how you kind of can present having an influence on a legislative file. The earlier the better. If a Finnish company or environmental NGO or an academic wants to have an impact on the EU file, often when the proposal is out, it might be very difficult. So there it's also a question of resources. Those that have a good resource, those countries and those stakeholders who know already when the proposal is coming, who know who to influence, and early enough can have a say on the file. And before the proposal, I would say it is the Commission that does the proposal. So if you can have an impact on those Commission people who are drawing up that proposal, you can have a say. Or then the Commission makes these consultations before the proposal comes out. So also answering these consultations, being there, even though for a small company or for a small lobbying organization, it's a big effort to answer to these questions. It might take a long time, but if you give your input, it can have an impact. And sometimes, then, for example, sometimes you see in the news or elsewhere that a Finnish stakeholder is completely struck and completely overwhelmed by a certain EU directive that has come out. That is already negotiated and is now being implemented to EU law, or to Finnish law. And at that moment, some stakeholders wake up, oh my God, this is completely against our interest, we don't want this is ruining our business, or environmentalists saying this is ruining the environment. And at that moment, it's very difficult to have an impact anymore when an EU law is implemented to national policy. So, but you see that sometimes that stakeholders are there 5 years too late to have an impact. So if you ever become a lobbyist, it is important to follow the EU agenda and to anticipate what is going to come and speak to the right people beforehand. And during the legislative proposal, I think this is where you should have an impact, but mostly this is where different stakeholders have an impact, or this is where they do their lobbying efforts. So after the proposal has come out, many different stakeholders publish their own position papers, what they think about a certain proposal, or they organize events in Brussels discussing the proposal from their point of view, or they held meetings with MEPs that are influential on the file, and so on. And most of this having an impact on the European Parliament, that's something that really goes on at Brussels level. So that's why you know and see that so many people work in Brussels, because that's where the decision makers are. But influencing the council, the member states, I think that is more something that happens at national level. So that's where the national decision makers meet, or national stakeholders meet national decision makers and liaise with them and discuss. And impacting the council, the member states at Brussels, my personal opinion is that that's more difficult, I think. Something that you do at Brussels is impacting a lot the MEPs, the European Parliament. But that's only part of the picture. There is also the council. So I'll just go for a small moment back to this picture. So after both of these institutions make an agreement, or they both have their own position, it should be more complex. So in theory, they should first try to find an agreement among themselves, and if they don't, they should converge again to the European Parliament, discussing again and finding a new position, and the Council discussing again and finding a new position. But nowadays, this is really what happens. So the Parliament makes their own opinion, own view on the Commission proposal, and the Council, the Member States, they make their own view on the Commission proposal. And after that, when they both have this position, they come together in something that is called a trilogue. So there are three parties, the Commission, the Parliament, and the Council. And they go in a small group to a room and try to find an agreement. So that's then where one specific member state cannot have a big impact anymore. That's where the Commission, the Council representatives, so the presidency now, for example, the Estonian presidency, and the MEPs, the rapporteur, the one MEP and some other MEPs from the Parliament come together and try to find an agreement on that file. And if they reach that agreement, then that is what you see and understand as EU legislation. So that's the agreement, that's the renewable energy directive, that's the decision on this governance regulation that I mentioned, or other issues, the electricity market. And that is then what is being implemented into national law. It either goes directly into national law, or then you have to, or then there's a 2-year implementation period, for example, before it goes into the national law. But that is what really happens. So very legalistic points of views to energy policy, I think, for you, different perhaps than what you hear normally. But I think this is important to go through if you ever work in EU affairs, in energy affairs. So this is something you have to know. Okay, so this was my EU part, EU institutions and EU decision making. We've already we've spent 45 minutes on this. Would you have any questions of clarification from up to now, from what we've covered? No? Okay. So then maybe I wanted to go to some topical files that are currently in the EU. So here I just made a word cloud from the Commission webpage. What are the words that are topical at the moment? And you can there perhaps see an overview of what is going on. If you are interested in a certain file, we've mentioned many of them. We can also, I'm open to ideas, we can discuss one of them as well. But I have a couple of examples that I wanted to go through, the most important ones, actually. I will start with this one. So as I mentioned, the EU has a goal of reducing its greenhouse gas emissions by at least 40% by 2030. And this is why you see energy and climate policies being very interlinked at the moment. And EU has agreed many different targets on how to decrease greenhouse gas emissions, increase renewable energy, increase energy efficiency, and increase interconnections, for example, between EU countries. And either all of these there are targets for 2020. These were agreed, let's say, a decade ago, and now what is being discussed at the very moment are these targets. So the EU targets for 2030, or actually the targets, they are already there, but what is being discussed is how it's being done at the moment. So we live in a very, very critical time if you think of the midterm energy and climate policy. So how are we gonna transfer our energy system towards 2030? 2020 is already very soon. And for example, Finland is going well with the 2020 targets, and the EU itself, it is in line, almost at reaching its 2020 targets, most of them. But what is very topical is this discussion over here, and very interesting. And what I really want to say, even though we talk about the field of energy, is that one thing that you see more and more and coming up all the time and transforming the energy discussion is the Paris Agreement, so the international climate change agreement that was decided 2015, so almost exactly 2 years ago. And energy policy, as I said, it's about economic growth, it's about energy security, but it is also about the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And with this new agreement, it's very ambitious, and we see it having an impact on the energy policy more and more. And before, energy and climate policy were not as interlinked, and nowadays they are basically together, and you cannot discuss one without the other. So that's why I think it's important to mention a few words about the role of Paris Agreement in EU energy policy. So the Paris Agreement is an international agreement where almost all of the countries in the world agreed to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and agreed to try to reach a level of well below 2 degrees of global warming. And many people estimate there will be a big report coming up next year, but estimate this to be a very ambitious target. And the EU wants to be a forerunner in fighting climate change. And this is an outspoken goal that the EU has. And it has, I don't know how you define it, but at least what the EU has been able to do is to show that it is possible to have economic growth and reduce greenhouse gas emissions at the same time. So this is an example for the world in that sense, even though the European EU is a small player. If you look at emissions, the emissions come from China and especially India, also Middle East at the moment or in the future. But it wants to give this example. And there will be mechanisms in the Paris Agreement for that countries have to make every 5 years more and more ambitious goals for reaching their greenhouse gas emissions. There's a mechanism where you have to always top up. You have to make a more ambitious goal every year. So personally, that's why, if I look at the future, and that was also one of the topics to cover in this course, what is the future, this mechanism in the Paris Agreement will also have an impact on EU energy policy, because there will always be a new revision, a new assessment of whether these targets, whether these are being reached and whether they are enough in the international context. So that's why it's so important at the moment, and I think also in the future, personally. I will give you just a couple of examples, and then I think we have time for discussion. Yeah, please.
Just a question. Do you think
Yeah.
that those objectives are actually realistic? Like, because, for example, for the Kyoto Protocol, they set these goals that in the end almost nobody reached. And I think, isn't it better, maybe for your opinion, isn't it better to set more realistic goals than these like really huge goals that maybe nobody will reach? Knowing like, because this is not just technology, this is not just a technology factor. We have to take into account also the politics and policies. So I don't really think these are realistic objectives that every country in Europe can reach. Maybe someone, but maybe we can just, I don't know, set different goals for each country in Europe because they have different kind of politics and environmental situations.
I think it's a very, very good and a current question. What is interesting in the Paris Agreement is that actually no one is saying to each country, you have to do this, you have to do that, you have to decrease that and that much. That's what was tried in Kyoto Protocol. They tried that to say, okay, you have to do this, you have to do that, and it failed. And as you say, no one really did it because you cannot say to another country, especially Europe, telling to the developing world, you have to do this and you have to do that, and it didn't work. So in the Paris Agreement, now the countries themselves make a pledge. They say, okay, by 2030, I can do this. By 2040, I can do this. So that's a different mechanism, which actually, as you say, also isn't enough, because now what the countries in the Paris Agreement have said, it will lead to a world of 2 to 4 degrees, by different estimates, a world of 2 to 4 degrees of global warming. So it's not enough. You're right. It's not enough. That's the world we live in. That is what the countries have done now. There's a global agreement which Finland wanted and the world wanted. So it's way better than what there was before. And there is this mechanism that you have to be more and more ambitious all the time. But I don't know if it's enough. There will be this big IPCC report will come out next year. And that will be actually the world is looking at that report. They will estimate what should be done in order to reach the Paris target. And no one knows, what it will entail. I don't know what it will entail. And whether at the moment the countries are not doing enough. But at EU level, you also mentioned the EU. Should EU countries be told what to do? In EU policy, countries have decided that this is a European issue, but it's also very difficult. So now the European Commission tells countries, you have to decrease this and this much, and you have to decrease emissions this and this much. And for many countries, that's very difficult. There is a supranational body telling them how much they have to reduce emissions. And that is based on different estimates of the GDP of the country. So countries like Finland with a high GDP end up with very high emission reduction targets inside the EU, whereas other countries that don't have such a high GDP have a lower. But the European case is different to the global case, because here indeed we have EU energy policy. That's why we talk about it, because there is European power. And in the international level, there is no such thing that UN or someone else would tell countries how much they have to reduce their emissions. So it's different, yeah.
Are there reduction targets for other countries, let's say in Asia?
There are not.
They're not.
Nationally, they tell that nationally. So China decides nationally what is their target, India decides nationally what is their target, and so on.
Do they have declining targets because the reductions?
Yeah, like for example, China, I think they said that they would peak their emissions by 2030, and then it would decrease because they're a country that the economy is growing. But actually that peak is now coming earlier, and China will, for example, shut down a lot of coal mines earlier than suggested or earlier than they themselves planned.
But you are
For
saying
example.
that they plan to grow the emissions still.
Yeah, they do.
That's very interesting.
It is, but then it's an interesting issue of the global economy. So Western countries have grown their emissions for decades, and now we realize we shouldn't do it anymore. But then there are other countries where the middle class is growing and where there is a very low GDP and poverty, and it's also a balance of whether you can say to these countries that don't make electricity networks for your people, or people who are off-grid communities who haven't been able to have a sustainable lifestyle, this kind of lifestyle that we have. So it's there are different questions. How can Western countries deprive other countries from wanting to reach the same life levels, for example?
But does this not lead to transfer of production from Europe to China, which pollutes more?
That's a good question that is discussed a lot and called carbon leakage. So that's a topic that often comes up, that if EU makes very high environmental regulation or has very ambitious goals for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, no one wants that a factory from Europe moves to China, where they will emit more because there's less regulation. So that's in no one's interest. That's not in the interest of business, that's not in the interest of countries, that's not in the interest of environmentalists either, because in Europe production is more efficient, more energy efficient, and we have the better technology. So that's in no one's interest. So that is something that people want to avoid, and that's why Europe, of course, wants all countries to have high standards, and that's where trade agreements, for example, come in. So trade agreements are something where you might have an impact on standards, for example, and you want to introduce your own European standards to other countries. By now, so far, there's no evidence of carbon leakage. There is no scientific evidence, for example, that production would have been moved from Europe to somewhere else due to high greenhouse gas emission targets. Might be other reasons, maybe labor standards. Workers, well, it's expensive here to hire people, less expensive elsewhere. It's difficult to say why a factory moves. Is it because of climate policy, energy policy, or labor policy? It's a difficult question.
Yeah, because somehow from the environment point of view, it would be that capacity should be transferred the other way around. From those that are very inefficient in those countries, which are more efficient, because you get the same production with less emissions.
Yeah, and that's why developing technology is so important, and it's also in the European interest that everyone would have high standards, because that would be maybe European education that would come of use to other markets as well. Yeah, it's a good discussion to have. Yeah. All right. Yeah, we have around half an hour or so. I had a couple of different examples, but actually we don't really so much need to go through them. There are two other examples of energy policy. Something to just mention is the energy union that the European Commission wants to build, but it's kind of like a slogan, it's a catchword. It's like a European Monetary Union, but without not a lot of flesh in the bones, so to say. But something that tells you that energy issues are very important at the European level. So it's a project where you want to build a union. So you want to build, for example, an integrated internal energy market, gas market, electricity market, and where, for example, this decarbonization a big thing. And one thing, for example, that I wanted to mention still was an example of a European issue, that is the interconnections. So as there was in one of my slides, the EU has a goal of building interconnections between EU countries. 10% of interconnections, so 10% of the interconnections of a country should be cross-border. And this is an EU goal. And Finland, for example, is well beyond this. And in order to, for example, increase renewables, as you know, you study the field of energy, you have to have a functioning electricity market and then functioning interconnections. And an European issue, for example, that is interesting for making a functioning electricity market is the situation of the Iberian Peninsula. So if we, for example, want to foster renewable energy and we want to foster the use of solar coming from Southern Europe, from Portugal or Spain, you need to have good interconnections from the Iberian Peninsula to Central Europe. And this is an interesting issue where national targets and European targets might be contradictory. For France, which is a very nuclear power-oriented country, France nuclear power is also something that they also export to other countries, and something that is very important for France. And they have been it has been politically very sensitive situation. Or France hasn't been very willing to build interconnections to the Iberian Peninsula in order for the Spanish and Portuguese renewable energy penetrating the European electricity market. And without these interconnections, it's not really possible. Now, what I've understood is that there's a new president in France, Emmanuel Macron, who is more open-minded to building these interconnections, but the previous governments haven't at all been positive. But apparently there is still a lot of technical or there's a lot of troubles to make these interconnections happen. But that is, for example, a European issue with national implications, and like an interesting example of how why you need European cooperation to build for increasing the uptake of renewables. Basically, Spain and Portugal are basically an island in the electricity market because of the lack of interconnections, which go through France to Central Europe. And they have a big production of renewable energy, for example. So it's an example of European energy policy issues. So actually, I think this is all I wanted to say. Give you a few examples and tell you about the EU in energy policy. And we discussed with Mikko that maybe I will tell a bit about my work. Maybe I will do that right at the end. So if you have any other questions or any other interest in the many files that are going on at the moment, like the renewable energy file, the energy efficiency directive file, the governance file that is going on, or electricity markets, I can try to give you as much information as I have. We have our experts who work on specific areas in the ministry, but I can answer as well as I can.
Actually, about the Iberian case, in case we would like to implement this kind of a EU-wide whole market and increase the transmission capacity, what kind of measures would we have to kind of build up more power transmission? Because if we look at the EU level, we would like to have more transmission power than it would be in the kind of a just France and Spain kind of national interests. What kind of measures we would have to build more capacity would pay that? How would it work?
Yeah, that's a good question. There is so Finland often thinks that these connections should be driven by the market. The market should pay for new connections. But then there are important pieces of infrastructure that can be estimated to be so important cross-nationally that there is European funding given for them. And this is called a list. There's a European list of these projects. So it's called the projects of common interest. And different gas pipelines and interconnections, transmission lines are applied to become a project in that list. And if they get to that list, they can apply for EU funding. And these Iberian France connections are for sure in the list, as is, for example, the Baltic Connector, which is the gas pipeline, as you know, which is being built from Finland to Estonia or from Estonia to Finland. And that pipeline will integrate European, the Finnish market to the Baltic gas market. And that project is 75% funded with EU money, and it would have not happened without that EU money. And this integrates Finland to the Baltic gas market. And similar projects are in place elsewhere in Europe, but there's a specific criteria that you have to fill in order to justify why market money isn't enough, why is this European money needed. And in the end, of course, that money comes from European taxpayers. But this 75% given to the Baltic Connector, for example, was a very big, so Finland is a net, gets more from this money than it gives to that bulk of money, since it got such a big funding for this specific connection. Yeah.
Solar case in the Iberian Peninsula is really interesting. I like the way you put it. And the nat gas is another one. And if you look at the different primary energy sources, where they are coming from, sun more in the south and gas from Russia and so on. Countries therefore have different views and positions, but what's the general sort of sentiment within EU towards the different energy sources, what they are promoting?
Good question. This is really, everyone does their own thing, you could say, because this is national. So as I mentioned, France, they really rely on nuclear power. Finland also relies on nuclear power. When we discuss the uptake of renewable energy, Finland, for example, achieves its renewable energy target a lot by bioenergy, whereas other countries, such as Denmark, achieve it with wind power. So I don't think there is really an overall picture that you could draw. Well, the big picture is that many countries have announced to phase out coal. Finland has said that Finland will phase out coal by 2030, and there are other countries like that as well. German Energiewende says they are abandoning nuclear power. They are the only ones in Europe. Other countries haven't announced that kind of decisions, at least to my knowledge. So I think the phase out of coal, that is a trend you can see. And Finland is also, I think, halving our oil consumption. And the general trend is declining fossil fuels and low carbon technologies. But low carbon technologies, always pay attention, of course, I'm sure you're aware about the difference between renewables and low carbon. Low carbon means also nuclear power when you talk about low carbon technologies. And renewables means solar, wind, bioenergy. But low carbon technologies, I think, in general, as a trend. Yeah.
So building on that one, so do you see, you commented Germany, so which is a leading nation in Europe, and they decided, as you said, to abandon nuclear energy. But I mean, there is not really any means, or do you see that they have means to replace the coal they are using? And there's a neighboring country, Poland, which is heavily dependent on coal as well, and big country.
You mean for Germany to replace coal?
Yes, to Poland as well.
Yeah. I know there are many commentators who see the Energiewende as contradictory maybe to the goals of Germany, also reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It's a very difficult question. Because they are in a very different position than other countries at the moment in their policy. And there's a lot of criticism towards that, where it's leading to. And of course, Germany itself has quite ambitious renewable energy targets, uptake of renewable energy. Energy efficiency is very important for them. You have to always keep that in the palette. But it's a very difficult question. I could comment more on the Finnish energy mix, but the German energy mix, I think for many people it's a question mark, but very difficult to say. Of course, with the European internal energy market, you can import electricity and gas. So that's of course also gas doesn't emit as much greenhouse gas emissions than other coal and fossil fuels. Yeah, please.
This is a comment related to your question, and I think it sounds somehow irresponsible from the German point of view, because they are such an advanced country. They can manage nuclear power if some country can manage it, and then if they import energy, for example, from this kind of what is it called? It's brown coal or brown coal producing countries, which basically means that they increase pollution by these actions. So it sounds very contradictory and irresponsible.
Aside of the generation, is there much sort of legislative processes or discussion going on regarding the energy storage and the new technologies for the storage?
That's more of a technology issue. So there's a promotion of, there's research and funding money given to promotion of technologies. And that's one of the pillars of the energy union. So Horizon 2020 research money and other research money that is given for investigating energy technologies, but it's not an issue that comes up in legislation as such. Of course, now with low emissions mobility and transport, this is really something that is interlinked, I think, as well to that topic. And there were just new proposals coming on targeting mobility, and emission reductions in mobility in general are a very big thing at the moment. That's a sector where we see most happening when it comes to emission reductions at the moment. But that's something that you can enhance by innovation. So you can give funding for that at EU level, and there is some funding available.
One more question about a different topic. The carbon credit, if you look at the trading system, I guess it hasn't really brought the results that was intended, that the price is next to nothing. What's the discussion around that? How do you see the future for the emissions trading? Also
very topical. So emissions trading has been going on for 15 years. And always when you see forecast or you see any research, it's always been calculated with the price of 30 euros per ton. And that's always been said that, okay, if the emissions trading would function, that's how much it would cost. But in reality, the price of 1 ton of emissions is 6 euros, 7 euros, 8 euros at the moment. And there are many reasons why it hasn't worked. For example, the recession that we had. So what you've tried to do in emissions trading is at European level estimate how much do we emit per year? How much do our industrial facilities, the 11,000 I think that are inside that emissions trading, how much do they emit? And when you suddenly have a decrease in GDP and production, then you emit less automatically, and it's not thanks to your great efforts on innovation or energy efficiency. It's because of the big recession that we had for the past 10 years. And the emissions trading has also been reformed. Now I think it was just completed, or it's about to be completed, a new agreement for post-2020. So the rules have been, it's a market mechanism, and Europeans love or favor, and Finland also really wants a market mechanism that would steer emission reductions. But in reality, it has been very difficult to make it happen. And it's been reviewed every year for the past years. There's always been a new kind of addition done to it. You take some, you backload, you take some of the credits away from the market, or you put them further, you try to adjust the system. And it's also a difficult question to what direction is it going. At least you can say that many other countries in the world are now also introducing emissions trading, and at least there are many mistakes that have been done in Europe that maybe we can say, well, don't repeat these mistakes when you're doing it. And that would be a functioning emissions trading would of course not be a regional emissions trading, it would be global, or it would be a big one. And in China, they are introducing emissions trading. More and more countries are trying to make an emissions trading system. And if they would not make the mistakes that have been done in Europe with designing this system, and if in the future these systems can interact with each other, then there can be, it can maybe only go to better. I don't know if it can go to worse. That's my personal opinion. So, and it's of course, I think all economists and many engineers find it fascinating. It's a fascinating system with how it functions, and it's going for the better for sure, but I don't know if it's good enough. And many countries actually now, when there was an agreement on emissions trading, at least France said that they will introduce national carbon pricing policies because they don't believe the emissions trading is giving enough of a signal. So I think we will more and more see some European countries adding. Like I think the UK has a floor price, and it makes it that's to some sectors that's £30 per ton or £40 per ton. So there are these examples in Europe of national carbon pricing, and since the emissions trading hasn't really given the results countries wanted, there are announcements that national measures will be taken. So maybe that will happen. Yeah.
Aren't these national measures just reducing the power of the general ETS?
Exactly. Yeah, they would be. Then it would not be the ETS giving the pricing now. Yeah. It's a very challenging field. But on the other hand, I don't. It's difficult to say. It hasn't worked for 15 years, and in the UK, their carbon pricing gives results. So you have evidence that those national measures have been working in another context. But of course, you're right, they are contradictory to each other then, to some extent. Please.
With respect to the recast of the Renewables Directive as part of the Clean Energy Package, what is Finland's position on the biomass sustainability criteria, or do you have a kind of a strong position and in a kind of a broader sense on it? So my experience, when formerly working in Brussels some years ago, of formal proposals on having biomass sustainability heating power. So, this is not to be confused with the sustainability criteria for liquid biofuels already existing for transport. The previous sort of position of Finnish industry, at least, that's what I was dealing with, was very anti having sustainability criteria. So I'm quite interested to see actually how the new criteria in the directive are being received, and a little bit more broadly, what's the objective for biomass heat and power in Finland in the long run? Because when we talk of renewables targets, we see that Finland has come most of the way so far through a source of renewables which has lots of experience, i.e. biomass, whereas in the future it might need to be other things. But specifically interested in your in Finland's position on the criteria as they are? Sorry, that's a bit detailed question.
Yeah, now you caught me here
Yeah.
that it's a very detailed question. So
Yeah.
I know I have colleagues who work on this day and night.
Yeah. Hopefully not nice, but
I have to say also night. It's a very heated topic at the moment. So now, as we speak, really, this is a topic that will be up for negotiation in Energy Council the 18th of December. So that's where the energy ministers will try to make a council position, so the member states' position on the Commission proposal. And I know these are very topical issues for Finland, but I cannot answer what are the details of it. So that would be something that I would have to refer to my colleagues who work more specifically on renewable energy.
what do you see in the longer run? I mean, I know it's a bit of an obvious question that Finland probably does have to do something in the other renewables aside from biomass. I mean, from your sort of situation, do you kind of see huge growth in biomass in the energy sector in Finland, or is it more kind of maintaining the current level and doing the work and other things?
Yeah, to my understanding, there is a will to increase, which comes from the will. There will be the projection that there will be more side streams from the paper and pulp industry, and these side streams can be used then in different energy production. But you speak about heat and power, of course, then a lot of it is liquid biofuels. But to my understanding, Finland has quite ambitious renewable energy targets, and most of these, the plan are to be achieved with bioenergy. So there is a plan to use a lot of it, or increase the use, but I couldn't be able to answer to which sources or which forms exactly, whether it's combined, whether it's heat and power, or it's also technology, I think. And one of the issues that you keep on hearing all the time is that we shouldn't constrain ourselves, because the technology and innovation is always going forward with the use of biomass, and you want to keep an open mind how you would use that in the future, because technology goes forward with this. But actually, that's the level of detail I can answer your question.
Can you say anything on LULUCF?
Very topical as well. So that's the so when you talk about reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, you talk about how to reduce them in different sectors, but then the other side of the coin are the sinks, what you refer to. So forests and also other issues, but especially forests, sequestrate, I think that's the word in English, take those emissions inside. And that's why when you talk about reduction of emissions, you also talk about how the forests are doing and how much those forests keep in greenhouse gas emissions. And that's a new topic in EU energy policy. We didn't have this kind of a pillar in the EU energy policy before. Now it's the third pillar. And that's very topical. The EU is deciding how big the sink in each country has to be in the future. And Finland has some difficulties with the reference years the Commission has come up with. Because Finnish the forests were very big in mid-2000s, but then the Finnish forest industry wasn't investing into Finland and wasn't really using the forests. And that's why many people view that the reference levels are not right, and the historical period that the Commission has chosen to what they compare the Finnish sinks is unjustified. And this is also a discussion still going on at the European level in the trilogue phase. So there's a Parliament position, a Council position, and now the countries the European Commission, Parliament and Council are at the moment discussing it, and it's been going on already for many months. and it's open. There is no result yet, but it's going on, and of course, a topic that has been a lot in the media. I think there was a question over there a long time ago.
Yeah,
You've been waiting.
Maybe you don't know, I mean, it's not really a topic, but do you think that maybe in the future EU and the European Union will promotize nuclear power, like promote nuclear power? Because I think that the goals that we have, maybe we won't reach them. So will they change like their approach and start to promote nuclear power, in your opinion?
Not as it is at the moment, because that's for countries to do themselves. That's not something the EU can say. And they are not saying that. Technology neutrality is the word. That is how you are supposed to base your decisions on giving EU funding, for example. Technology neutrality, and the goal is to reduce emissions. And that's the EU goal, and then the member states themselves decide how they achieve that. And then it's up for the member states, the countries themselves, to promote nuclear energy if they want. That's the answer as it is. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Are there more questions? Maybe I'll just say a few words about the ministry still, as an employer, just for those also who are interested. I already mentioned about this one job opportunity, so if this raised your interest, apply next spring. So I'm the EU person in the energy department, and as I said, my background is in EU administration and EU law, and then I've worked with energy for some years. And what I do is, for example, now there's the energy ministers meeting coming up in 2 weeks' time. And a lot of my work, for example, at the moment deals with that meeting. So we inform the Finnish Parliament on what is going to happen in that meeting. We speak with the minister. Today I've been writing bullet points for the minister for speeches that he's going to make about the Energy Ministers' Council. We do a lot of, also other speeches when other ministers travel in energy topics, write background information for them on this front. And then I have some specific files that I follow myself. I attend meetings on those EU files, attend those meetings in Brussels in the building that I showed you in the Energy Working Group. So when that topic is being discussed in the Energy Working Group, traveling there and informing the Finnish diplomat who sits there what is the Finnish position, what should Finland say, what is our negotiating position, writing minutes about that meeting, informing my colleagues. So it's a negotiation process. So it's a lot about communication and information flows between ministries, between your colleagues abroad. So there are countries that are, for example, like-minded. You have meetings with the countries that think alike and think what is your negotiation position. And then other issues. I also work with other international affairs. I work with International Energy Agency. So, for example, just last week we had a group of 10 researchers or different people from different IEA, International Energy Agency countries, making a review of Finnish energy policy. And that was a big bulk of work. We've gathered a lot of data for them. They're going to make a review of how should Finland change its energy policy. Very interesting international context and a very interesting process.
Excuse me,
yeah.
Can I ask on that one?
Yeah, sure.
I saw some tweets about that.
Okay.
I think it's quite interesting.
Yeah.
Is that data available, or the report, is it public or?
The report will be available then next year. So the last report they did was 2013. Where they make suggestions for Finland, what should we do in our energy policy. Now they came to Finland for 1 week to meet all the different stakeholders in energy policy, and they're gonna. They got data, they met these people, and now they are making recommendations. But they will write them throughout next spring. So it's a writing process. The process is in the beginning, and then the report comes out next summer or early fall. So it's in the beginning of the process, but very interesting. You rarely get this kind of feedback from the international level. It can be very interesting. Yeah. So this is different kind of aspects, and as I said, I leave my cards here. So if you had any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me. And thanks for the lively discussion. Actually, I met the person who was here from Energiavirasto last week, and he said there was a lively discussion, and I can agree. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks.